If you enjoy true disturbing horror stories, you would definitely be a fan of my channel. I upload true stories regularly, so if you want to be part of the journey, please like and subscribe. As always, enjoy the video. I was swiping through Tinder on a Friday night, like most people do when they're bored and looking for some excitement in their otherwise mundane lives. I was in a new city, freshly relocated for a job, and I figured I might as well try to meet someone interesting while I was at it. After a few harmless encounters, most of which ended in awkward conversations or ghosting, I came across a profile that stood out. The pictures were dark and moody, with a hint of something that caught my interest, an air of mystery. The guy looked rugged, with a chiseled jaw and deep-set eyes that seemed to pull you in. He had a few tattoos and a smirk that suggested he was up for a bit of trouble, and I like trouble. We matched almost instantly, and he sent a few messages that felt strangely intimate, even though we were strangers. He talked about his love for adventure, hiking, and exploring the abandoned places around the city. It sounded intriguing, and I thought maybe this was the spark I needed to break out of my comfort zone. After a bit of back and forth chatting, he suggested we meet up for drinks. I hesitated for a split second, but the thrill of meeting someone new won out over the caution that had been drilled into me by friends and family. On the night of our date, I dressed casually but carefully, wanting to strike that perfect balance between approachable and intriguing. We agreed to meet at a bar that was known for its quirky atmosphere and craft cocktails. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against the bar, looking exactly like his photos but somehow even more magnetic in person. The conversation flowed easily, and I felt an instant connection. He was charming, funny, and had that wild glint in his eyes that made every word sound like an invitation to adventure. As the night went on, he suggested we go for a walk. I was hesitant at first, but the atmosphere was electric, and I couldn't resist the allure of spontaneity. We strolled through the city streets, the cool night air wrapping around us like a comforting blanket. He led me to an old, seemingly abandoned warehouse that he claimed was a hidden gem, a place where he often went to gather his thoughts. I should have felt a red flag waving, but I was too caught up in the moment to pay it any mind. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted. The dim light barely illuminated the crumbling walls, and unsettling quietness enveloped us. He began to tell me stories about the place, how it used to be a hub for artists and musicians before it fell into disrepair. I found myself entranced by the way he spoke, his passion making the eerie setting feel almost magical. But as he continued, I noticed that his demeanor shifted slightly. There was a darkness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He started talking about the people he'd met in the area, mentioning how some of them had gone missing over the years. I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush off the creepy vibe, but he didn't seem to be joking. His tone was serious, and he leaned closer, as if sharing a great secret. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was like he was weaving a web, and I was slowly getting tangled in it. I knew I should have left, but something kept me frozen in place. He moved closer, and I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I thought about making an excuse to leave, but the playful side of me wanted to see where this was going. I was intrigued, even if my instincts were screaming at me to turn back. He seemed to sense my hesitation, and with a sly grin, he suggested we explore deeper into the warehouse. Against my better judgment, I agreed, thinking that maybe this was part of the adventure. We wandered further into the depths of the building, moving past old crates and rusted machinery. The air was thick with dust, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I felt like I was stepping into a forgotten world, and every inch of me was on edge. He led the way, and I followed, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and dread. It felt like we were crossing some invisible line, stepping into a realm where the normal rules didn't apply. After what felt like an eternity of wandering, we stumbled upon a small room. It had a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. There were remnants of old furniture, and the atmosphere felt heavy with history. He turned to me, a glint of something wild in his eyes, and for a moment, I felt completely trapped. This was no longer just an adventure. It was something darker, and I realized I was in over my head. He started to talk about the history of the place again, but his words began to blur together. I could barely focus as panic began to rise in my chest. I wanted to leave, to get out of this abandoned place and back into the safety of the city lights. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and a primal instinct kicked in. I took a step back, trying to gauge his reaction, and that's when I noticed the way he was looking at me, like I was the next chapter in some twisted story he was writing. In that moment, I knew I had to get out. I turned and started to walk back the way we had come. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence, and I could feel him following closely behind. There was an urgency in my movements, and the adrenaline coursed through me like a jolt of electricity. As I approached the entrance, I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see in his expression. Once we were outside, the cool air hit my face like a refreshing splash of cold water. The glow of the streetlights felt like a beacon of safety. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but he was still right there beside me, his presence looming in the darkness. We walked in silence, the weight of the night hanging heavily between us. I could feel the tension building, and I knew I had to create some space. As we approached the bar, I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom. I slipped inside, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind me. I took a moment to collect myself, splashing cold water on my face. I thought about how quickly the night had turned from thrilling to terrifying, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was going to get out of this. After a few minutes, I gathered my courage and opened the door, ready to make my escape. But as I stepped out, I found him waiting right there, leaning casually against the wall, a predatory smile on his lips. I felt a chill run down my spine as he straightened up, his eyes glinting with something that felt dangerously exciting. I knew I had to go, but the way he looked at me made it clear that he wasn't going to let me leave easily. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. Sometimes, the adventure you think you're signing up for can quickly turn into something you never bargained for. And as I walked past him, I felt the weight of his gaze on my back, the thrill of the night morphing into something far more sinister. I made my way out of the bar, not looking back, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I didn't know if I'd ever swipe right on Tinder again. So I'm scrolling through Tinder one night, half-heartedly swiping left on profiles that just don't catch my eye, when I come across this girl named Sarah. She had a killer smile and an adventurous vibe that made me pause. We matched almost immediately, and after a few messages back and forth, I felt a spark. She was funny, flirty, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. It felt like I had struck gold in the Tinder lottery, so I suggested we meet up for drinks that weekend. The day arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. I chose a cozy little bar downtown that had the perfect ambience for a first date. I got there early, ordering a drink to calm my nerves while I waited. Sarah walked in right on time, looking even better in person than her photos. We clicked instantly, chatting away like we had known each other for years. We shared stories about our lives, our interests, and even our regrets. There was an undeniable chemistry, and as the night progressed, I felt more and more drawn to her. As the night wore on, Sarah suggested we head to a nearby park for a night walk. It sounded romantic, and I was all in. The park was pretty quiet, illuminated only by the occasional streetlight, which made it feel kind of magical. We walked side by side, laughing and enjoying each other's company. But then, as we strolled deeper into the park, something felt off. The laughter began to fade into an uneasy silence, and I started to notice the shadows lurking around us. We reached a secluded area where the trees were denser and the moonlight barely filtered through. I was about to suggest we turn back when Sarah suddenly stopped and looked around. Her expression changed, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was an odd tension in the air, as if we weren't alone. I turned to ask if she felt it too when I noticed someone standing a few yards away, just out of the light. My heart raced. The figure was obscured, but I could make out a silhouette. Before I could say anything, Sarah grabbed my arm and pulled me back. There was a frantic urgency in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She whispered something that I couldn't quite catch, but it felt like she was urging me to leave. I glanced over my shoulder at the figure, and it seemed to step closer, merging with the shadows. Panic started to set in as I realized we were in a potentially dangerous situation. We turned around and started walking briskly back the way we came, but the figure followed us. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, and it sounded like they were getting closer. My mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. I wanted to ask Sarah what was going on, but I felt like any noise would attract the figure even more. We picked up our pace, trying to stay calm while my heart pounded in my chest. Just as we reached the edge of the park, I dared to glance back again. The figure had stopped a few feet away, just watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen that silhouette somewhere before, but the thought was too terrifying to dwell on. We burst out of the park's entrance and into the streetlights, feeling momentarily safe. But Sarah didn't stop. She kept walking, dragging me along with her, until we were far enough away to catch our breath. Once we were a few blocks away, we found a bench and sat down. I tried to piece together what had just happened, but Sarah seemed off. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip from the water bottle she'd brought along. I finally mustered the courage to ask her about the figure. She hesitated, her eyes darting around like she was afraid it might show up again. After a moment, she confessed that she had seen that figure before, at multiple places she frequented. My stomach dropped. She went on to explain that she had been getting these strange, unsettling vibes for weeks. She had dismissed them as paranoia, but now she felt like she was being followed. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The girl I thought was fun and adventurous had a side to her that was deeply troubled. Suddenly, my romantic evening had turned into something much darker. I should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I asked her more about it, trying to understand what she was going through. She described how she'd started noticing a man lurking around her apartment complex, watching her from a distance. At first, she thought he was just a neighbor, but his behavior became increasingly erratic. He'd show up at odd hours, and she would catch glimpses of him in the corner of her eye as she went about her day. It was as if he was always there, just out of reach. As she spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that was creeping back in. I realized that this wasn't just a random occurrence. There was something sinister happening. We decided to cut the night short and head back to our respective homes. I offered to walk her back, and she hesitated, but eventually agreed. The walk back felt heavier than before. Every shadow seemed to bend and stretch, and the distant sounds of the city were drowned out by the thudding of my heart. We reached her place, and I walked her to the front door. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on us. After a short hug goodbye, I turned to leave, glancing back one last time. That's when I saw him. The figure was standing across the street, staring directly at us. My stomach twisted. Sarah noticed too. Then her eyes widened in horror. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I sprinted back to my car, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I drove home in a daze, replaying the night in my head, feeling like I had just been part of a horror movie. The next day, I tried to shake off the anxiety, convincing myself that maybe it was all just a coincidence. I texted Sarah to check in, but she didn't respond. Hours turned into days, and I started to worry. I eventually reached out to mutual friends, but they hadn't heard from her either. It was as if she had vanished. Weeks passed, and I couldn't get her out of my mind. I found myself driving past her apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. Each time, I felt more unease settle in my gut. I started to think about that figure, how it had been watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something much darker than a simple first date. The whole experience was haunting, and I still can't shake the feeling that something bad happened that night. In the end, Tinder turned out to be the least of my worries. The app that was supposed to help me find a connection instead led me down a path of fear and uncertainty. I sometimes wonder what happened to Sarah, if she ever got away from whatever was haunting her. And that shadowy figure, I can't help but feel he's still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross his path. So, I got this Tinder story that still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. It was one of those random days when I was swiping left and right, trying to find someone who didn't look like a total weirdo. I was in a pretty chill mood, and like everyone else, I thought I'd give this dating app a shot. You know, the usual swipe, chat, maybe grab a drink, and see where it goes. I had a few decent matches, but nothing too serious ever came from it. Until I came across Mark. Mark's profile was the typical mix of adventure and charm. His pictures showed him hiking, traveling, and even one with a cute dog, which is basically catnip for anyone on dating apps. His bio was witty but not over the top, just enough to make me curious. We matched, and our conversation flowed surprisingly well. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. I thought, okay, this could be fun. After a few days of chatting, Mark suggested we meet up for coffee. I was a little hesitant because, let's be real, meeting a stranger from Tinder in a somewhat secluded cafe can be a gamble. But he seemed normal enough, and I figured, why not? So, I agreed to it. We decided on a little cafe tucked away in a quiet part of town, which felt like a good idea at the time. There's something about those cozy spots that makes you feel safe, right? The day of our coffee date arrived, and I dressed casually, nothing too fancy. I walked into the cafe and scanned the place for Mark. He was sitting at a small table in the corner, his dark hair slightly messy, but in a charming way. As I approached, I noticed he had a bit of an intense look, like he was deep in thought. He stood up to greet me, and we exchanged pleasantries. At first, everything seemed fine. We talked about our jobs, our favorite movies, and even shared a few laughs. But as the conversation went on, I began to notice something off about him. He would sometimes stare a little too long, and his laugh felt forced, almost like he was trying too hard to impress me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just nervous. We talked for nearly 2 hours, and while it was mostly fine, there were moments when he'd say things that made my skin crawl. He seemed to have a fascination with crime documentaries and true crime podcasts, which I thought was a little strange. But hey, to each their own, right? As we finished our coffee, Mark suggested that we take a walk around the nearby park. I figured it would be a nice way to continue our date, so I agreed. We walked for a bit, and he started talking about his love for the outdoors, how he enjoyed hiking, and how he often went camping alone. At first, it sounded adventurous, but then he mentioned something about how he liked to go to secluded areas where not many people went. That's when a little alarm bell went off in my head, but I brushed it aside, convincing myself he was just being dramatic. As we strolled, the conversation shifted to relationships. Mark became increasingly intense, talking about how he believed in soulmates and how he could sense a connection with me. It was flattering at first, but then it took a weird turn. He started discussing the concept of soul binding and how he believed that two people could be tied together in a way that transcended life itself. I chuckled nervously, trying to steer the conversation back to safer topics. But he was relentless, and it felt like he was trying to pull me into this strange, dark world of his thoughts. At this point, I was starting to feel uncomfortable. I glanced at my watch, realizing I had to get going soon. But Mark didn't seem ready to end the date. He suggested that we head to his favorite spot in the park, a secluded area that was supposedly very picturesque. The idea of a secluded spot with this guy set off alarm bells in my head. I hesitated, but he seemed genuinely excited about it, so I reluctantly followed him. We walked a little deeper into the park, and I started to feel anxious. The trees grew thicker, and the path became less defined. It was pretty, but there was an eerie quietness around us. Mark kept talking, but I found it hard to focus on what he was saying. My intuition was screaming at me to turn back, but I didn't want to seem rude. When we finally reached the clearing, it was beautiful. Sunlight filtering through the leaves, flowers blooming all around. But I still felt uneasy. As we stood there, he turned to me with this intense gaze. He started talking about how amazing it would be to be out there, just the two of us away from the chaos of the world. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like he was trying to paint a romantic picture of something that felt incredibly wrong. I remember thinking that I needed to make my exit. I casually mentioned that I had to get back, that I had some things to take care of. But he didn't take it well. His demeanor shifted. He went from charming to something else entirely, almost desperate. He started talking faster, mentioning how he had been waiting for someone like me, how he felt this connection was meant to be. My heart raced. I felt trapped in this clearing with him, and all I wanted was to get back to my car. I could feel panic rising in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. I managed to excuse myself again, saying I really needed to go. He stepped closer, and I could see something dark in his eyes. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was as if he could sense my fear. I couldn't wait any longer. I turned on my heel and started walking back the way we came. I could hear him behind me, calling out, but I didn't stop. I just kept walking faster and faster until I finally reached the main path of the park. I didn't look back. I walked briskly to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and took a deep breath. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety flood over me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see him standing there. But the road was empty. Driving home, I replayed the entire date in my mind, trying to make sense of the bizarre shift in Mark's demeanor. I had gone from thinking I was having a nice date to feeling like I had narrowly escaped something sinister. I deleted his number, unmatched him on Tinder, and promised myself I'd stick to coffee dates in well-lit, busy places from then on. I still think about that day sometimes, how close I was to something unsettling. It's a story I share less with friends and more as a reminder that sometimes the weird vibe is there for a reason, and trusting your gut is everything. So, there I was, swiping through Tinder like it was my second job. You know how it goes, some days you find a gem. Other days it feels like a graveyard of bad choices. I wasn't really looking for anything serious, just some conversation, a few laughs, maybe even a drink or two. That's when I stumbled upon Claire's profile. She looked cute, with a quirky smile and a love for hiking, which, let's be real, I found pretty appealing. We matched, and I felt a little rush of excitement. At first, our chats were light and breezy. We talked about our favorite trails and exchanged stories about our most memorable hikes. It felt easy, like I had known her forever. Claire had this infectious energy that made me want to keep the conversation rolling. After a few days of chatting, we decided to meet up for drinks at a local bar. I was feeling optimistic, thinking maybe this could be the start of something fun. The night of our date, I showed up a little early, trying to shake off the nerves that had crept in. I scanned the crowd, looking for her. When I finally saw her, I felt a mix of relief and excitement. She looked just like her pictures, maybe even better in person. We hugged, and I was immediately struck by how warm she felt. We settled into a booth and started ordering drinks, and the banter just flowed. It was a classic first date vibe until it took a turn I wasn't expecting. As the night went on, I started to notice some odd things about her. For one, she kept checking her phone every few minutes, almost like she was waiting for something or someone. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe she was just anxious or had friends checking in. But then there were these little comments she made about her past relationships, and I noticed a flicker of something in her eyes when she talked about them. It was like she was trying to convey a deeper meaning, but I couldn't quite grasp it. The atmosphere shifted a bit as she began to share some of her hiking experiences. She started talking about a recent trip where she had gone solo. It sounded adventurous until she mentioned how she had gotten lost for a few hours, and had to rely on her survival skills. The way she described was almost too detailed, like she was reliving a trauma. I nodded along, trying to encourage her to share more, but something about the way she spoke sent chills down my spine. As the night wore on, I tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and steering the conversation towards safer territory, but Claire was on a different wavelength. She began to drop hints about how she had a dark side. I laughed it off, thinking she was just being playful, but the way her eyes narrowed when she said it made my skin prickle. There was an intensity to her that was both fascinating and unsettling. Midway through the night, she excused herself to the restroom. I took the opportunity to scroll through my phone, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. While I was mindlessly scrolling, I noticed a notification pop up from a group chat I was in. It was just the usual memes and banter, but as I glanced up, I saw Claire standing at the bar, talking to a stranger. The guy looked older, and they seemed to be deep in conversation. I tried to shake it off, but something about it felt off. I could see her gesturing emphatically, her hands moving like she was telling some wild story. Then, as if sensing my gaze, she turned and looked straight at me. It was unsettling. She didn't smile or wave, just stared as if she was trying to gauge my reaction. I quickly looked down at my phone, pretending to be engrossed in whatever was on the screen, but I could feel her eyes still on me. When she returned, she seemed different, almost charged with a new energy. I was trying to engage her in conversation, but she kept drifting away, her mind somewhere else. She mentioned needing to get out of the bar for some fresh air, and I figured, why not? It was a nice night, and maybe a change of scenery would help ease the tension. We stepped outside, and that's when things got weird. Claire started talking about her love for the outdoors, how it made her feel alive, and how she believed in living life to the fullest. But then she launched into this bizarre story about how she had once followed a stranger into the woods after a party, claiming it was the most exhilarating thing she had ever done. I didn't know how to respond to that. It felt like she was toying with the line between thrill-seeking and danger, and I was starting to feel like I was in over my head. As we walked, I felt the need to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but she kept bringing up her adventures, each more disturbing than the last. She spoke of a time she had gone camping alone and woke up to find someone had been watching her. Instead of fear, she described it as a rush, and she claimed she had confronted the person. I couldn't help but think that maybe she was embellishing her tales, but the intensity in her eyes made it hard to dismiss entirely. At this point, I was feeling a mix of intrigue and discomfort. Part of me was fascinated by her wild stories, while another part was screaming at me to get out of there. I tried to lighten the mood, suggesting we head back inside, but Claire wasn't having it. She wanted to keep walking. I felt trapped, like I was being pulled into a narrative I didn't want to be a part of. We ended up at a small park nearby, where the shadows seemed to loom larger than life. It was quieter here, and I could hear the rustle of leaves in the wind. Claire's stories took a darker turn, and she began to weave tales about people disappearing in those very woods. It felt surreal, like she was trying to scare me, or maybe even impress me. I wanted to laugh it off, but the way she spoke, so passionately yet with a hint of danger, made me question her sanity. Eventually, I mustered the courage to suggest we head back, but Claire just smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She leaned closer, and for a second, I thought she was going to kiss me, but instead, she whispered something about how sometimes you have to take risks to feel alive. That was it for me. I politely excused myself, claiming I had an early morning. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes boring into my back. I hurried to my car, heart racing, and the moment I got in, I locked the doors. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person I had just spent the evening with. To this day, I still have no idea what to make of that night. I still see her profile pop up occasionally, but I swipe left without a second thought. Some adventures just aren't worth the risk. So here's the thing. I never thought I'd have a story like this to tell. You know those horror movies where someone makes a dumb decision and you're sitting there, yelling at the screen, "Don't do that." Yeah, that was me, but in real life. It all started on a lazy Saturday night when boredom hit harder than usual. I thought, why not swipe right and see what happens? I'd already been on a few dates that were either total flops or just plain weird, but this time I was optimistic. I matched with this guy named Jake. He seemed cool enough, with a couple of fun pictures and a bio that was lighthearted. He mentioned that he loved hiking and traveling, and honestly, those were two of my favorite things. We hit it off over text, swapping stories about our favorite trails and travel mishaps. I felt a connection, which is always a bit of a gamble on these apps, but I was willing to take the risk. He suggested we meet up for a hike the next weekend, and I thought it was a great idea. Fresh air, exercise, and a chance to get to know him better. Sign me up. The day of the hike came, and I was both excited and nervous. I picked out a sporty outfit, threw on some sunscreen, and packed a small backpack with water and snacks. We agreed to meet at the trailhead of this popular local spot, which was known for its beautiful views. As I drove there, I couldn't shake this weird feeling in my gut. It wasn't fear, more like a prickling sense of caution. I shrugged it off, told myself I was just overthinking things. When I arrived, Jake was already waiting, leaning against his car with a casual smile. He looked just like his pictures, which was a relief. We exchanged pleasantries, and I was immediately struck by how much he could talk. He had this energy that was both charming and a little overwhelming. We started the hike, and at first it was great. We laughed, shared stories, and the scenery was stunning. But as we climbed higher, I noticed something off about Jake. He had this intensity in his eyes that was a mix of excitement and something darker. The trail began to narrow, and the conversations turned from lighthearted to a bit unsettling. He started talking about how he loved the feeling of being on the edge, both literally and figuratively. He mentioned extreme sports and how he had no qualms about taking risks. It was like he was trying to impress me, but I couldn't help but feel this creeping discomfort. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but he kept circling back to his thrill-seeking lifestyle. After a while, we made it to a beautiful overlook. The view was breathtaking, and for a moment, I forgot about the weird vibes. We took some pictures, and I tried to shake off the uneasiness. But then he suggested we go off the main trail a bit to explore a less traveled path. I hesitated, but something in his eyes made me feel like I had to agree. It was either go along with it or risk him thinking I was boring. So we veered off the main trail and into the woods. At first, it was okay. The trees enveloped us, and the sounds of the birds and rustling leaves were peaceful. But then the path started to get steeper, and I could feel my heart pounding a little harder with each step. Jake seemed invigorated, like he was feeding off the adrenaline of being in a secluded area. My uneasiness returned, now mixed with a sense of dread. As we climbed, he began to share darker stories, tales of near-death experiences, and how he felt alive in those moments. I started to think that maybe I had misjudged him. Perhaps he was just a guy who loved to push limits. But then he did something that sent a shiver down my spine. He suddenly stopped, turned to me, and said he wanted to show me something. I felt a rush of panic as he led me off the path deeper into the woods. I followed him, but every instinct in me screamed to turn back. The trees grew thicker, and the sunlight started to fade, casting eerie shadows. We reached a small clearing, and he pointed to a rock formation that jutted out over a drop-off. He looked at me with a mix of excitement and something else, something I couldn't quite place. He wanted me to climb up there with him, to stand on the edge. I hesitated. My heart raced as I looked down at the rocky drop below. It was dangerous. I tried to voice my concerns, but the words tangled up in my throat. He laughed, told me it was just a bit of fun, that I shouldn't be so serious. That was the moment I realized I was in way over my head. I didn't want to be a part of this thrill-seeking escapade anymore. I suggested we head back, but he became insistent. The shift in his demeanor was palpable. The playful guy I had met earlier was gone, replaced by someone more intense, almost predatory. I felt trapped. The woods were too quiet, the shadows too long, and I was alone with a guy who seemed to be enjoying my discomfort. I decided to play along for a bit longer, hoping to find an opening to escape. Eventually, he climbed up onto the rock, and as he stood there, arms outstretched, I felt a rush of fear. I could barely breathe, watching him revel in the danger. I knew I had to get out of there. I took a step back, feigning a search for a good photo angle while plotting my escape route. My heart pounded as I slowly made my way back to the path, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he did. The moment I turned to leave, he bolted down from the rock, panic flashing across his face. I didn't look back, just sprinted down the trail as fast as I could. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, urging me to keep running. I raced past the overlook, through the trees, not daring to glance behind me. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I locked the doors and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him appear behind me, but he never did. I drove away, the weight of the experience settling in. As I left the trail behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly dangerous. Looking back, it's crazy how quickly things can go from fun to terrifying. I learned my lesson the hard way. Sometimes a match on Tinder can ignite a fire you weren't prepared to handle. It was one of those nights where I was just mindlessly scrolling through Tinder, half-heartedly swiping left and right while binge-watching some terrible reality show. I had been single for a while, and while I was okay with it, the occasional thrill of a match had its appeal. I wasn't expecting anything serious, just some casual chats, maybe a date if the vibe was right. But what happened that night was something I never could have anticipated. I stumbled upon a profile that caught my eye. The guy was handsome, with that rugged look that screamed adventure. His bio was short but intriguing, mentioning a love for hiking, cooking, and a weird obsession with collecting vintage cameras. There was something about his smile that felt genuine, and I swiped right, hoping for the best. Almost immediately, we matched, and I felt a rush of excitement. We started chatting about our mutual interests, and he seemed charming and down to earth. As the conversation flowed, he talked about his recent hiking trips and how he loved to document them with his camera. It sounded fun, and I found myself wanting to know more. A few days later, after a series of texts and some light banter, he suggested we meet up. He was planning a hike over the weekend and invited me to join him. I hesitated at first because I didn't know him very well, but the idea of an adventure was tempting. Plus, my friends had been nagging me to get out more. After some back and forth, I agreed, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. The day of the hike arrived, and I dressed in my best outdoor gear, trying to look cute yet practical. When I arrived at the meeting spot, my heart raced as I scanned the area, hoping to spot him. He was already there, leaning against his car, wearing a baseball cap and a flannel shirt. He looked even better in person, and I felt a flutter in my stomach. We exchanged pleasantries, and he led the way to the trailhead, chatting about the scenery. The hike started off great. The weather was perfect, and the conversation flowed easily. We shared stories and laughter, and I felt myself becoming more comfortable around him. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The trail became less maintained, surrounded by thick trees and an eerie quietness. I could feel a slight chill in the air, and I started to question if we were going too far off the beaten path. He seemed unfazed, though, almost energized by the change in scenery. I tried to shake off my concerns, reminding myself that I was here for an adventure, and I didn't want to come off as a wuss. After about an hour of hiking, we reached a clearing. It was stunning, with a beautiful view of the valley below. but something felt off. He suggested we take a break, and I agreed, grateful for the chance to catch my breath. He pulled out a small camera from his backpack, claiming he wanted to capture the moment. While he fiddled with the settings, I took a sip of water and enjoyed the view. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, trying to dismiss it as paranoia, but the sensation lingered. Once he was done taking photos, he turned to me with that charming smile. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, a glint that made me uneasy. He started asking more personal questions, things that felt too invasive for someone I barely knew. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but he persisted, probing into my life, my family, my past relationships. It felt like an interrogation, and I could feel my discomfort growing. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I suggested we head back. My gut was telling me it was time to leave, but he insisted we explore a little further. He mentioned a secret spot that was supposed to be breathtaking, and I felt the pressure to be adventurous again. Against my better judgment, I agreed, but I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. We walked on, and the trail became even less defined. The trees grew denser, and the light began to fade. My nerves were getting the better of me, and I started to regret my decision. I could see he was enjoying the whole thing, almost as if he thrived in this unsettling atmosphere. I tried to keep my pace steady, but I could feel him inching closer to me, his presence becoming more imposing with every step. It was as if he was trying to assert some kind of dominance, and I hated how powerless I felt. Finally, we reached a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but it felt wrong. He stepped forward, looking around with a sense of satisfaction, while I stood back, scanning the area for a way out. I was starting to feel trapped. He turned back to me, excitement in his eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. I tried to downplay my discomfort, laughing at something he said, but inside I was panicking. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart dropped, and I turned to see what it was. It was just a rabbit, but the fear had already taken hold. I decided it was now or never. I had to make an excuse to leave. I told him I thought I heard my phone ringing, and I needed to check it. He seemed annoyed but didn't push back. I quickly turned and started walking back the way we came, hoping he wouldn't follow too closely. To my relief, I heard him call after me, but I didn't look back. I picked up my pace, my mind racing. The trail felt different on the way back, darker, as if the trees were closing in on me. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to find my way back to the car. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I sprinted, the sound of my breathing drowning out everything else. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line and onto the main trail. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. I glanced back, expecting to see him emerge from the woods, but he never did. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The relief was overwhelming, but the terror lingered. I drove away without looking back, my heart still racing. That night, I deleted Tinder. It was a lesson learned, a reminder that sometimes the thrill of adventure can lead you down a path you never intended to walk. I didn't need to learn the hard way again. I can't believe I'm telling this story. It's one of those things that sounds made up, like something out of a bad horror movie. But trust me, it's all true. So let's rewind to a couple of months ago when I was swiping through Tinder like it was my job. I had just come out of a long relationship and was ready to put myself back out there. Maybe meet someone cool, have a little fun. You know, the usual. I matched with a guy named Jake who seemed pretty chill. His profile was just enough to spark my interest. He had this rugged look with a few scruffy tattoos peeking out from under his shirt and a smile that could charm anyone. We chatted for a few days, and he seemed normal enough, sharing little anecdotes about his life, his love for hiking, and his obsession with horror movies. Honestly, I thought we had a good vibe going. After a week of texting, we decided to meet up. We chose a local coffee shop, a place with a cozy atmosphere and great pastries. I remember feeling a blend of excitement and nervousness as I walked in. I spotted him right away. He was sitting at a table, scrolling through his phone. As I approached, he looked up and gave me that same charming smile. We talked easily, a mix of laughter and shared interests. It felt like a pretty solid first date. After a couple of hours and a couple of refills on our coffees, Jake suggested a walk in the nearby park. I thought it was a great idea, so we strolled through the trees, chatting about everything and nothing. I was really enjoying myself, but then things started to shift. As we walked, he began sharing some darker stories. He talked about how he loved true crime documentaries and how fascinated he was by serial killers. At first, I thought it was just him trying to impress me with some edgy conversation, but then he started getting a bit too detailed. He mentioned a few cases I had never heard of, going deep into the psychology behind these criminals, and I felt the mood turn slightly sour. I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but he seemed fixated on this theme. It was like a switch had flipped, and he was no longer the charming guy I met at the coffee shop. He was intense, animated, and frankly, a little unsettling. I felt that familiar pit in my stomach, that instinct telling me something was off. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I kept nodding and trying to engage. Eventually, we found ourselves sitting on a bench, and he leaned in, lowering his voice. He started talking about the thrill of the chase, the adrenaline of being in control. I don't know what it was about the way he said it, but my skin crawled. It felt like he was sharing a secret, but it wasn't one I wanted to be part of. By this point, I was looking for an excuse to leave. I made up a story about having an early morning the next day and began to gather my things. Jake seemed unfazed, almost amused. He walked me back to my car, and as we reached it, he leaned against the hood, blocking my way. I could feel my heart racing. I tried to casually laugh it off, but he just stared at me with this intense gaze, and for a moment, I felt like I was caught in a web. Somehow, I managed to slip past him, and once I was inside my car, I locked the doors and sped off, my mind racing. For the next few days, I tried to push the whole thing aside. Maybe I was overreacting. I had been in a long relationship, and maybe dating again just felt strange. But then Jake texted me. At first, it was just a casual message, asking if I'd like to meet up again. I hesitated, but eventually replied, trying to keep it light. I told him I needed some time to think. The next day, he sent another message, more aggressive this time, asking if I was ghosting him. That's when I decided to block him. You think that would be the end of it, but no. A few weeks later, I started getting these weird messages on social media. At first, they were just random accounts, but eventually, they started to resemble Jake's style. Dark, cryptic messages that made me feel uneasy. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. I was paranoid, looking over my shoulder everywhere I went, convinced he was following me. One night, I was out with friends at a bar, trying to relax and have a good time. I was finally starting to forget about the whole ordeal when I glanced toward the entrance. My stomach dropped because there he was, Jake, standing in the doorway, scanning the room. My heart raced, and I ducked down in my seat, hoping he wouldn't see me. I texted my friends, and they quickly came to my rescue. We moved to a different area in the bar, but every time I glanced up, I saw him still lingering like a shadow. It was terrifying. Eventually, my friends convinced me to leave, and as we walked to the car, I felt that same sense of dread creeping back. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was fixated on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. I ended up reporting him to the platform and blocking any other accounts I could find. The next few weeks went by in a blur of anxiety. I was hypervigilant, checking my surroundings at all times, convinced that Jake was lurking around every corner. I avoided going out alone and even changed my usual routines. As time passed, the messages slowed down, and I started to breathe a little easier. I thought maybe it was over. I thought wrong. One night, I was at home, finally feeling somewhat relaxed, when I heard a knock at my door. My heart dropped. I looked through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. It was him. I couldn't even think straight. I didn't want him to know I was home, so I stayed quiet, hoping he would leave. I could hear him outside, mumbling to himself, and I felt paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, he finally left, but I knew this wasn't the end. I ended up moving shortly after that. I couldn't take the stress anymore. It felt like my life had turned into a horror movie, and I was the reluctant star. I've been on a few dates since, but I always keep my guard up. Jake taught me a lesson I never wanted to learn. Sometimes the charming guy with the perfect smile can be hiding something much darker. It started as a typical Tuesday night, the kind where the week drags on, and you find yourself scrolling through Tinder, half-heartedly swiping left and right while binge-watching some mediocre show. I've been on the app for a while, thinking I might meet someone interesting, but mostly it was just a parade of boring bios and blurry selfies. But that night, something caught my eye. A profile with a striking picture. This guy had a smirk that somehow felt charming rather than cocky. His bio was enigmatic, hinting at adventure and spontaneity. I swiped right, and to my surprise, we matched almost instantly. At first, our conversation was light and breezy. We shared our favorite movies, music, and a few random fun facts. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, which was refreshing compared to the usual one-liners I had grown accustomed to. As the chat progressed, he mentioned some outdoor activities, suggesting we meet for a hike that weekend. I was hesitant at first. Meeting someone from an app always felt like a gamble, but there was something about him that eased my nerves. Maybe it was his confidence, or the way he made even mundane topics sound exciting. The day of the hike finally arrived, and I stood in front of my mirror, nervously adjusting my outfit. I decided to keep it casual but cute, not wanting to overdo it. When I arrived at the trailhead, I spotted him leaning against his car, a water bottle in one hand and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked just as good in person, with sun-kissed skin and an easy smile. We exchanged pleasantries and started down the trail, the initial awkwardness fading as we chatted about everything and nothing. As we made our way through the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of nature surrounded us, but there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. He had a way of steering the conversation towards darker topics, sharing stories about his past that felt oddly unsettling. He talked about his childhood, how he often felt like an outsider, and how he had a fascination with the macabre. I tried to laugh it off, thinking he was just being edgy or trying to impress me. But then he mentioned his interest in true crime and serial killers with a strange glint in his eye. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just an odd quirk of his personality. But as we continued hiking, I noticed the way he kept drifting off the main path, leading us deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it was just a more scenic route. The trees thickened around us, casting shadows that made the sun-drenched day feel more like twilight. I casually mentioned that we might be going off track, but he just laughed it off, claiming he knew a secret spot that was worth seeing. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached a small clearing. It was beautiful but eerily quiet, the kind of place where you wouldn't be surprised to find a hidden horror movie scene unfold. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. He set his backpack down and pulled out a couple of water bottles, and I took a sip, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. As we rested, he began to tell me about a particular fascination he had with urban exploration. He mentioned exploring abandoned buildings, giving me detailed descriptions of some places he had visited. The way he spoke was almost reverent, like he was reminiscing about sacred ground. But then he started talking about a particular building, a long-abandoned asylum notorious for its dark history. He spoke of the thrill of wandering through its decaying halls, describing the chilling atmosphere in a way that made me shiver. I should have said something, should have turned back, but a part of me was still curious. I wanted to believe that he was just an odd guy with a quirky hobby. So I hesitantly asked him if he had ever spent the night in one of those places. His eyes lit up, and he launched into another story, this time about a night spent in a decrepit old house rumored to be haunted. The way he described it was so vivid. I could almost see the flickering lights and hear the whispers he claimed haunted the hallways. After a while, I suggested we head back. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the woods were growing darker. He reluctantly agreed, but I could sense a change in his demeanor. The easy charm he had earlier seemed to fade, replaced by something more intense. He began to walk faster, almost as if he were eager to get somewhere. I felt a rush of panic. I didn't want to seem scared or paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into a trap. As we navigated the winding path back, I tried to distract myself by talking about mundane things, but he seemed less responsive, his answers short and clipped. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. When we finally reached the car, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I was relieved, but also confused. How had a simple hike turned so unsettling? He offered to drive me home, and I accepted, still feeling the weight of the experience. The entire ride was filled with an uneasy silence, the tension palpable. As we pulled up to my apartment, I thanked him for the hike, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. He smiled, but there was something behind that smile that sent a chill down my spine. I thought that would be the end of it, but as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed against something dark and unsettling. I opened my Tinder app, half hoping to delete it, but then something stopped me. I saw his profile still active, and in that moment, I realized he had a hold on me, even if it was just a lingering sense of dread. A few days passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a weird date. But then I received a message from him, one that sent my heart racing. It was a picture of the old asylum he had described, with a caption that read, "You should come explore with me next time." I didn't respond. I deleted the app, blocking him without a second thought. It was a strange ending to what had started as a simple swipe, but I knew I had dodged a bullet. The thrill of online dating had turned into something sinister, and I was grateful to have escaped unscathed. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would have a story like this, but here I am, sitting in my cluttered apartment, still processing what happened. It all started on a Wednesday night. I was bored, scrolling through Tinder, trying to find someone who could provide some distraction from my monotonous routine. I swiped left on a bunch of profiles, and then I saw him. He looked like a model with a killer smile and a few tattoos peeking out from under his shirt. His bio was short but sweet, mentioning something about loving adventure and being spontaneous. Those words struck a chord with me. I was in a rut and really needed a spark in my life, so I swiped right. We matched almost instantly, and I felt a little rush of excitement. We chatted for a bit, and he seemed charming enough. He had this air of confidence that was both alluring and intimidating. He suggested we meet up that weekend, and I figured, why not? I hadn't met anyone interesting in a while, and I was ready to break out of my shell. Fast forward to Saturday, and I was a ball of nerves. I spent way too much time picking out what to wear, wanting to make a good impression. I chose a cute but casual outfit, something that felt like me. The plan was to meet at a trendy little bar downtown. I arrived early, my heart racing with anticipation. When he walked in, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. He was even more attractive in person, but there was something about his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. He looked at me with an intensity that felt a little too much, but I brushed it off as first date jitters. We sat down, ordered drinks, and the conversation started flowing. I found myself laughing at his jokes, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't quite shake. He talked a lot about himself, his travels, and all these incredible experiences he'd had. I was impressed, to say the least, but the more he talked, the more I felt like he was trying to sell me on something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. As the night went on, he leaned in closer, his eyes boring into mine, and I felt that tension ramp up. He mentioned that he liked to push boundaries, that he craved excitement in everything he did. I laughed it off, thinking it was just his way of trying to be edgy. But deep down, a part of me was starting to feel uneasy. I kept glancing at the door, wondering if I should make a quick exit. But the drinks kept coming, and I found myself trapped in this weird, intoxicating whirlwind of his energy. Eventually, he suggested we leave the bar and go for a walk. It was a beautiful night, and I figured a stroll would be nice. We wandered through the city, and I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. We ended up in a quieter part of town, and I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The streetlights cast long shadows, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic. He started to talk about some of his more extreme adventures, skydiving, bungee jumping, and even something about a near-death experience while rock climbing. I nodded along, but his stories started to sound more like warnings than tales of bravado. At one point, he stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. He said he wanted to take me somewhere special, somewhere off the beaten path. My gut twisted. I didn't like the sound of that. I glanced around, looking for a way out, but he took my hand and led me down a dark alley. Panic surged through me, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. I followed him, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The alley was narrow, and the air felt thick. I could barely see the walls, but there was graffiti everywhere. He stopped in front of an old, rusted door, and my heart dropped. He pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room that looked like a cross between a storage space and an art installation gone wrong. There were strange sculptures made of discarded items, and the walls were covered in even more graffiti. It felt surreal and unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. He stepped inside, pulling me along, and I felt like I was in a horror movie. The door creaked ominously as it closed behind us. I was surrounded by this odd mixture of adrenaline and fear. I wanted to leave, but he was right in front of me, and I didn't want to provoke him. He started to explain the art around us, how it represented freedom and breaking societal norms. I nodded, but my mind was racing. I wanted to find a way out without alarming him. Then he started getting more intense, talking about how most people were too afraid to embrace their true selves, how they lived in a bubble and never really experienced life. I felt like he was trying to recruit me for something. As he spoke, I inched backward, trying to create some distance. His eyes were wild, and I could see the passion morphing into something darker. I remember thinking that I needed to get out of there, that this was not the adventure I signed up for. Finally, I made my move. I told him I needed to use the bathroom, which wasn't even true, but I figured it was my best chance. I slipped past him and opened the door. The alley was still dark, but I bolted out into the street, my heart pounding. I could hear him calling after me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, navigating through the streets, not stopping until I reached a well-lit area filled with people. I finally stopped to catch my breath, and adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a wave of nausea. I looked around, realizing how close I had come to a situation that could have turned much worse. I never went back on Tinder after that night. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes things aren't what they seem, and the thrill of adventure can quickly turn into a nightmare. I learned the hard way that the spark I was looking for wasn't worth the risk. I swiped right on Tinder one rainy evening, half-heartedly hoping to find someone to share a slice of pizza with. My friends have been pestering me about getting back into dating after a pretty rough breakup, and I figured, why not? I wasn't expecting anything serious, but I was curious enough to see who was out there. That's when I matched with him. Let's call him Jake. He had this charming smile, rugged looks, and a bio that made him sound like the type of guy you want to grab a drink with. We hit it off pretty quickly, chatting about our favorite movies, music, and the odd quirks that made us who we are. He seemed normal, maybe even a little too perfect, but my judgment was clouded by the excitement of the moment. After a few days of messaging back and forth, we decided to meet up for coffee. It was a cozy little cafe, filled with the scent of freshly brewed espresso and baked goods. When I arrived, I spotted Jake immediately. He was sitting at a table in the corner, looking exactly like his pictures. He stood up to greet me with a friendly smile, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The initial awkwardness melted away quickly as we dove into conversation. He was charming, funny, and genuinely seemed interested in getting to know me. I was captivated. As the coffee turned to lunch and the lunch turned to ours, I began to let my guard down. We talked about everything from travel to our childhoods, and I found myself laughing more than I had in a long time. But as the sun started to set, I noticed something odd. He was becoming a little more intense, leaning closer with every word, his gaze almost uncomfortably piercing. It was like a switch had flipped, and the guy who seemed so easygoing was suddenly a little too eager. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just nervous, and I didn't want to ruin the good time we were having. After our date, he suggested we go to a nearby park for a walk. I hesitated at first, but the sun was setting, and the park was beautiful, so I agreed. As we walked, Jake started talking about his interests, and I listened, nodding along. But the longer we walked, the more he began to share these bizarre stories about his life. He talked about how he had a fascination with paranormal activities, which I thought was quirky at first, but then it started to feel a bit unsettling. He mentioned some of the places he had visited, abandoned buildings, old prisons, and even graveyards. It was like he was trying to impress me with this dark side of his personality, and I started to feel like I was in a horror movie. Then he casually mentioned that he had a collection of knives. I laughed nervously, not sure if he was joking or if he was serious. He explained that he liked to collect unique knives and that he often used them for camping and survival situations. At this point, I was feeling a mix of intrigue and discomfort. It felt like there was a fine line between charming and creepy, and he was definitely towing it. I tried to change the subject, but he kept coming back to the topic of survival skills and self-defense, as if he was trying to gauge my reaction. As we continued walking, he suddenly became very animated, pointing out various landmarks and telling me stories about them. I was starting to feel uneasy, like I was being led into something I didn't want to be a part of. I noticed he was getting a little too close again, invading my personal space. At one point, he brushed against me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like something in his demeanor shifted, and I could sense a darkness lurking beneath his charismatic exterior. When we reached a secluded area of the park, I suggested we head back. I could feel my heart racing, and the casual vibe from earlier was long gone. Jake, however, seemed to take my suggestion as a challenge. He insisted we keep walking, saying he knew a great spot to see the skyline. I felt trapped. I didn't want to seem rude or overreacting, but every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there. I started to make small excuses about wanting to get home, but he brushed them aside, insisting I would love the view. Finally, I mustered the courage to tell him I really needed to go. He paused, and for a moment I saw that charming smile falter. I could see a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a grin. We started walking back, and I felt a wave of relief, but that relief was short-lived. Just as we approached the entrance of the park, he reached for my hand and pulled me closer, insisting we take a selfie together. My gut twisted as he leaned in, his face way too close to mine. I forced a smile, but all I could think about was how to get away. After the selfie, I quickly said goodbye and hurried to my car, my heart pounding the whole way. I felt like I had just escaped a trap. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off about Jake. I tried to rationalize it, wondering if I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Later that night, I looked at the selfie we had taken. It made my stomach turn. I couldn't focus on the fact that we were smiling. All I could see was a glint in his eyes that felt predatory. I decided to unmatch him on Tinder, thinking about how grateful I was that I trusted my instincts. Even now, weeks later, I still feel that unease when I think about that date. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the seemingly perfect guy isn't what he appears to be. I guess I learned that swiping right can lead to unexpected places, some of which are better left unexplored.